I think, as everyone knows, data is driving the global economy. We're creating data right now, and yet there are no really internationally agreed rules on data. Unlike other areas of economic activity like trade, we don't have data governance rules that are widely accepted in the world. There are bits and pieces of rules, but not an international system. And that is very much something that that is under development and their discussion in various forums. Former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe introduced the concept of data free flow with trust, or DFFT, at the World Economic Forum in January 2019. And that concept to try to fix this sort of gap in data governance globally. And that proposal ultimately received endorsement by G20 leaders at the Osaka summit later in 2019. But there are still a lot of questions or gaps in what DFFT actually means and how it's going to actually be operationalized. And that's a challenge that Japan has taken on again in its host of the Group of Seven, the G7 grouping this year in 2023. They're trying to move this concept of DFFT from concept to actually implementation. And there will be some discussions of this topic for sure, because we had a preview of this at CSAS earlier this year from both Digital Minister Kono and METI Minister Nishimura, who mentioned that this is going to be and I think actually Prime Minister Kishida also mentioned it in his speech here in Washington in January. There's going to be a G7 Digital and Technology Ministers meeting next month in Gunma in Japan. And then the G7 leaders meeting itself will be held in Hiroshima in May. And it is likely that DFFT is going to feature in both of those summits.
All right. Smash that like if you haven't done so already. Let's kick into our next segment. This is in regards to Jasmy. I'm going to give a shout out to this particular guy. His name is Brian. He hosts Jasmy Twitter Spaces with Zippy and a few other guys that have been doing Jasmy coverage for probably like over a year before I was even doing it. So these guys, in my opinion, are like the heavy lifters, if you will. So he says, thanks for sharing to this guy, Yanis Slav. All right. This is a good article for anyone to read that isn't familiar with DFFT. And you may be wondering, like, what the heck is DFFT? Well, we're going to get into that. But it says here, the framework is very favorable to what Jasmy is offering as a platform. Very interested to see how things take shape in the coming months and years. Now, here's the thing, right? I don't want to do anything that, some people refer to as a nothing burger and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, this is something we should pay attention to, okay? So, obviously with Quant and some of these other projects, we talk about, for instance, CBDCs or we talk about, central banks and, which one will be the one that moves the money that's connected to some of these things, for instance, is Swift going to work with XRP, when it comes to some of these things, and, is XLM with the, the peer-to-peer money, is it Quant with, the interoperability, all these types of concepts, right? Well, what about this Jasmy with this thing called DFFT? You may not even know about it, right? So what exactly is DFFT, you may be wondering, right? And that's a very, very good question. And we're going to jump into this for just a brief moment. And here it is. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this real quick. Actually, before I do so, I'm just going to tell you what DFFT is. So it means data free flow with trust, DFFT. Now, as you can see right here, when we blow this up, let me see if this is big enough. Yeah, it looks like it is. It says, in the nearly 4 years since the DFFT was endorsed by the G20, Japan has advanced the concept in several ways. In April 2021, a G7 roadmap for cooperation on DFFT was adopted at the G7 Digital and Technology Ministerial Meeting. The roadmap laid out 4 key cross-cutting areas of cooperation. Number 1, data localization. Number 2, regulatory cooperation. Number 3, government access to data. And number 4, data sharing for priority sectors. Now, back in May of 2022, this roadmap was built upon the new G7 action plan for promoting data-free flow with trust, which reaffirmed these 4 areas of cooperation while adding focus to fostering future digital regulatory interoperability, promoting DFFT in the context of digital trade, and sharing knowledge about international data spaces and emerging interoperable data sharing architecture. Japan has also infused DFFT into new trade agreements, such as the, listen to this, U.S.-Japan Digital Trade Agreement, which is USJDTA, and the Japan-UK Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which is the Japan-UK EPA. Now, I know it's kind of like a mouthful. I also want to reiterate this as well. So my theory, and I guys, don't get me wrong, it's just a theory. I don't think I'm too far off on this. Again, the whole thing with Quant, doing that application for a patent in Japan, being approved. Everything that you saw outlined here, I know this is supposed to be a Jasmy segment, but we're going to get into that. Everything that you've seen outlined here when it comes to some of the things that are mentioned, adding focus to fostering future digital regulatory interoperability, promoting DFFT in context of digital trade and sharing knowledge about international data space. I mean, like all of this stuff basically says to me, you know what? Quant would work with Japan to create that regulatory interoperability, with cooperation with the government for access to the data and data sharing for private sectors and so on and so forth. To me, that just simply makes sense. Also makes sense in regards to even Jasmy. So when we get further into this, I'm going to blow this part up because it's a little bit small for whatever reason. Pull this up. And here we go. This is a little bit bigger. So institutionalizing DFFT. You're going to hear a lot of talk about, institutional money. You got to get regulatory clarity to get the institutional money. But what about the whole concept of Japan? Like we mentioned before, when it comes to Japan, they already get it. They're already embracing crypto. They're already embracing blockchain technology, Web3, all this stuff, right? So what about institutionalizing DFFT, right? Great question. It says operationalizing DFFT is largely a matter of institutionalizing DFFT. For the concept to be put into practice and scale globally, DFFT must be incorporated into the architecture of the global economic order. Japan hopes to establish a single forum for DFFT where governments and other stakeholders can convene to discuss and develop rules and frameworks for global data governance, ideally at an existing international organization such as the OECD with a designated secretariat. In conjunction with this DFFT secretariat, Japan is launching an institutional arrangement for partnership on DFFT, a multi-stakeholder group involving governments, policy experts, companies, universities, and other relevant entities. I know this is a lot verbatim, but I don't want you guys to miss out on any of this. That's why I'm reading a lot of it verbatim. Together, the DFFT Secretariat and its broader multi-stakeholder community would develop specific projects and work streams to implement DFFT with close coordination and monitoring. They, of course, got to select the right ones. So selecting the right institution to be a steward of DFFT's next phase is the essential OECD, which represents all G7 countries. You may not know about that. States is a strong candidate with its history of work on global data governance. In the future, probably within the next week or so, I'm going to look more into OECD and try to give you guys an update in regards to this, because I think this right here is something that we should pay really close attention to. I'm just going to throw that out there. So get used to seeing a little bit more in regards to OECD. But yeah, with its history of work on global data governance and recent success in advancing multi-stakeholder work streams related to trusted data flows. However, the OECD represents only 38 member countries. 38 is just not enough, right? But, I guess it's from the broader, bigger perspective of having 200 plus. That's a good point. But it says lacking the near universal membership of organizations such as the WTO, another proposed approach convening a more flexible form of data regulators akin to the model, or akin, excuse me, to the model, not akin, of the G20's Financial Stability Board. So, one thing I want to mention is, this whole thing of, like it says, convening a more flexible form of data regulators. When we have this concept here in the United States of, we have to have regulatory, regulatory framework, and our elected officials, if you will, got to come together and get really something going and so on. That regulatory framework, as we know, can lead to the regulatory clarity to get the institutional money coming in. But what about like this other side of the world, the Far East, Japan, when it comes to data regulators, right? Like, understand that there's that's a big deal. So I want people, the reason why I'm showing this to you guys is I want you guys to understand that there's a big reason why Jasmy or Japan, both come hand in hand when it comes to the importance of protecting data privacy, and so on. So if you have Jasmy labeled as the Bitcoin of Japan, right, which is a pretty good title in itself because it means that they're the first, right? And then having, some of these outlines of, a flexible form of data regulators, right? That's, connect the dots, if you will. These are some good things, to say the least, because if you have some of these connections, to me, it's like, well, they are already embracing crypto. They're embracing blockchain technology, distributed ledger technology, all this stuff. Well, what about having a financial stability board? What about having, like it says right here, expand inclusive institutional money, not money, but the capacity in regards to that, right? How is it you're going to make everything inclusive? Well, you got to have somebody that's going to be regulating the data, if you will. So, it's one thing to have, for instance, Jasmy with their blockchain technology through Hyperledger Fabric, for instance, but it's another to have an actual board or committee that's going to come together in regards to some of these proposals, as you can see in regards to the DFFT. Now, it says whichever approach is adopted, the institution that is selected to house DFFT must be made up of similar like-minded and ambitious countries and organizations. Hence why Japan is definitely towards the top of that list, because of how ambitious they are in regards to, embracing all this, Web3, you name it. This institution should serve as a focal point for disparate conversations on data governance occurring in global forums such as the WTO, OECD, G20, and G7, as well as plurilateral groupings such as APEC and even the IPEF. So I wanted to point that out. We're going to jump back into another part of this, and I'll blow this up as well. Hold on just a second. All right. So there's been some recommendations since then, right? And if anything, what are some of these recommendations? To me, this is pretty big stuff, especially if you hold Jasmy, or especially if you're just a person that understands that, again, it's not just so much about Jasmy. You could definitely interject like Quant because of the interoperability. So the recommendations: Japan has the opportunity, guys, listen to this, to leverage its G7 host year to operationalize DFFT by having the leaders of the world's largest advanced liberal democracies endorse an institutional framework for implementing data governance concept. This is massive. You were wanting to listen to something that, when is Max going to get to some of the juicy stuff? This is the juicy stuff, plain as day, because, like I mentioned last week, it's like we're talking about, Brian Armstrong, with Coinbase. Then you saw a little bit from even Hedera, with some of those board meetings, right? You even saw Danelle Diston on Bloomberg. I mean, it was just like, who's the next one's gonna like pop up here? And I think we even saw a little bit from in regards to Ripple and so on. But the point is while we're trying to figure things out, especially here in the United States, which, you know, some people are like, man, we're never going to figure anything out. Well, what about, like, you know, Europe and so on, right? Are they going to get together and so on? Well, it seems like the ball is starting to roll as far as in that right direction, right, to get things started. But put that aside, there's a country, a region in the world who they already get it, and they're already implementing things, and they're already embracing the technology and so on. So again, introducing Japan to the big mix, right? So having the leaders of the world's largest, you know, and so on, endorse an institutional framework for implementing the data governance concept. The CSIS economics program recommends that Japan take the following steps to move DFFT forward. And you read it right on the screen. When is this, Max? Is this in 2024, 2025, 2026? No. It is this year. Are we not paying attention to this? It's this year. So when I say things, you know, and I know I say a lot of things, right? And I'm not trying to hype people up too much, but once in a while I do a little bit of hype. If it's warranted, I have to have something to back up that hype. Here's something that backs up the hype of when Max always says, and I know I'm referring to myself in the third person, it's kind of weird, right? But here's a perfect example of when I say, hey guys, I feel as though Jasmy could get us there first. Well, you know, I've also mentioned in the past, I feel as though Quant could very well get us there first, you know, hence why it's consistently my number one, right? So for the purpose of this, let's focus on obviously Jasmy. So when I say things like, could Jasmy get us to the promised land first? When you see things like this and understand some of the connections they have, and understand that, you know, you even saw Hari quoted that one particular governor, I forgot his name, you guys seen it in the past and so on, about some of the things they're introducing as far as, you know, tax cuts and incentives for small and big businesses, right? Then you got to realize, like, why would he want to quote some of this, right? You got to keep in mind, some of these guys do have some of these connections. It's not just, you know, former Sony executives and that's it. No, they got some big connections. So, you know, this thing coming up in Tokyo, Japan, for instance, coming up here soon, that's big. But look what's mentioned here. Define trust and refine its application. While trust is central to the DFFT concept, it remains vaguely defined. Now, it says Japan should seek an agreed upon definition of trust from the G7 that incorporates both basic privacy, security, and other protections, but also avoids being so rigid or prescriptive that it precludes interoperability of data regimes. See next recommendation. Japan and its partners should also refine specific priority data sectors that DFFT should apply to, and how this definition of trust can be applied in each specific data context. Now, with that said, let's take a moment to take a step back, soak in the information, and recognize this. So we have a huge problem in the world, right? We focus on what's going on with the BRICS countries and so on. You know, BRICS as a collective conglomerate group, basically together, is a real threat to the United States, is, you know, as far as GDP power rankings. Right. We get that. And, you know, it's a problem because, you know, some other countries, especially in South America, are basically going to be, or have been, as some of the reports, buying, for instance, in Chinese yuan or some other, you know, particular currencies, other than the US dollar, right? And we're losing our power play in the world. Now, you may be thinking, well, what does this have to do with this, Max? Just hear me out. The reason why we want to put so much focus on this thing of you know, the trust from the G7 and so on is this. If the path forward for innovation and, you know, probably, you know, eventually getting the United States on board and so on, we have to have a big power player that gets it, right? And understand, you know, Japan is part of the G7 and so on, right? So there's a difference between GDP power rankings, you know, and then BRICS also being a threat to that. As far as, you know, United States is still number one. Keep in mind, Japan ranks number 3 in GDP power rankings. They're also part of the G7, right? So as a collective group of G7, that in itself still has a lot of power ranking in the world as a collective group when it comes to GDP. So, we've mentioned in the past, well, what country could emerge and I guess you could say be the hero of, in my opinion, moving forward to, let's face it, get the United States possibly to get out of their head, their heads out of their butts and so on. I think it could very well be Japan, because if we look upon Japan and we could see the big power moves that they're doing and so on, well, them being part of G7 and so on, and us as well, the way I look at it is, look what's going to happen here. What could happen is we can finally get together and get something really, really going to get part of that clarity that we're looking for. Does it start with Japan? I think it very well does. What does that mean for projects like Jasmy and so on? Again, you can draw your own conclusion, but there's more in regards to this before we kick it back into the comments. And I want to mention this, and that is, it says Japan and its partners should also redefine, or I should say refine, the specific priority data sectors that DFFT should apply to, and how this definition of trust can be applied in each specific data context. It says focus on making national data governance systems interoperable. National data governance systems interoperable? Well, that would cover all the G7 countries. That would cover even the ones that are not part of G7 and so on, right? Yes, we talk about getting that massive volume, getting some of that, insane market cap for, crypto, the utility run. Is Japan going to be the one that really gets the utility run going because they already get it ahead of the rest of the world, or at least, over the United States? Very well could be. Here's an example. As Japan operationalizes DFFT, it should focus on the important and realistic option of ensuring that all countries' approaches to privacy, cybersecurity, financial oversight, and other data-related issues are compatible. Governments have and will continue to have heterogeneous approaches to these issues. Rather than driving toward a single global regime of harmonized laws and regulations, listen to this is the juicy stuff, the DFFT concept should be focused on building interoperability between national data systems based on shared principles and mutual recognition. Now, you may be thinking, well, how is that the juicy stuff? The reason why this is the juicy stuff is this. What is the point of us having regulatory, clarity and regulations that seem like it comes from a centralized approach? Do you get what I'm following? Are you following what I'm saying here? If you put laws into place that sound like, the concept of a central authority, it's kind of like damned if you do, damned if you don't. I mean, if Bitcoin came out of, a white paper because it was a beautiful concept of, decentralization, and then we have the governments of the world coming together, basically speaking, and I'm going to stop the share on this particular one, coming together basically, and, it's like, we're going to have one main authority. Some people say it's the World Economic Forum behind the scenes. Could very well be. But the point is this. Having one main authority laying down the laws for all the countries, does that sound like decentralization to you? No, it does not. This outline I've given you guys today, I'm telling you flat out, this very well could be the path forward to real, true decentralization through regulations that simply make sense. I think Japan gets it done for all of us personally. I'm going to call it right now. Moving forward, I think Japan is going to be like the one country that's going to be looked upon as, the heroes in the crypto space. We're always talking about like, a win for Ripple is a win for all crypto. Yeah, absolutely. But when it comes to regulatory compliance, regulatory framework, clarity, and all that, am I too far off with this outline tonight? I don't think I am.
Thank you so much for watching, guys. If you have not yet subscribed, do yourself a favor and subscribe for more information on the ISO 222 compliant tokens, and hit the notification bell to make sure that you are aware of the new videos when they come up. Max and I cover these ISOs, and we also have a live show every single night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Make sure you tune in for that. You won't want to miss it. Thanks again, and we will see you on the next video.